Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bolaji Aluko, and I have the honor and privilege of being asked to moderate this panel 8 of the Achebe Colloquium, a panel titled The Niger Delta Crisis, the Political, Economic, and Environmental Conundrum. As a son of the Niger Delta myself, on my mother's side, and she's Ijaw, and knowing the political, economic, and environmental importance of that relatively small, troubled, and troubling southern portion of Nigeria, there can be no more exciting panel to moderate than the one of today. We actually have a distinguished panel of ambassadors, past and present, of scholars, young and old, and of activists, militant and not so militant. And we also have a governor of that region. In fact, there was such a rush to include people in this panel that we had to cast lots. And mixing metaphors here, I had to become a firefighter to make sure that we have this panel. I want to acknowledge the fact that I was here last year, and I wish to acknowledge the quiet passion shown by Professor Achebe, who sat and sits quietly in all of these sessions. And I sometimes wonder, at his age, what he thinks how our country has become the way it has. If you look at your program, there are a number of people who are already on seat. His Excellency Chibuike Rotimi Amaechi, Governor of Rivers State, who needs no further introduction. I remember when he was still Speaker of Rivers State, he came to visit Howard University, and I was the host of the group that came to host them at that point. We have Dr. Judith Burdin Asuni, visiting scholar of SAIS, of African Studies of SAIS, Johns Hopkins University. We have Ms. Annkio Briggs, who is a Niger Delta activist of long repute. We have the irrepressible Ambassador John Campbell, who raised a firestorm last time we were here and has continued to raise one. We have Dr. Isidore Udoh, J.C.L. from the Niger Delta World Congress. And we have Dr. Peter Lewis. I always say Peter, anywhere there's Nigeria being talked about, Peter and a few other scholars around the U.S. will always be there. Darren Q, Richard Joseph. I called them a mafia last time. Richard didn't really like that. Richard Joseph did not like it. But they are part of that mafia. And then, well, of course, we have the Ambassador Adefuye, a fiery defendant of the Nigerian image and of, I guess, the Nigerian government, too. So without further ado, there are a few ground rules we're going to have. The order of speaking is what we have on the program, except for the fact that Dr. Adefuye will speak last. He has requested that, I'm sure, for good reason. I don't think he wanted me to tell you that, but I've told you that right. The ground rules are that each one of you will speak for about 7 to 8 minutes. I will no longer prompt you because the order is already there. And after you have spoken, we will then, depending on how quick you do this, I may ask a few questions and then we'll throw it open to the public. Please, 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 do not take more time than you need, because we want to be able to have as much discussion as we can. There is no keynote speech. It is a panel discussion in which you are simply supposed to excite the people who are listening. And then later on, we'll have some closing remarks from each one of you, and then from the governor of Rivers State. So without further ado, the governor himself.
Can you hear me? I will avoid protocols since we're not in Nigeria. And I want to assume that if we were in Nigeria, the governor would have spoken last, so that the ambassador won't have the right to reply. The right of reply dwells only in the hands of the governor, except the president is there. But since we're not in Nigeria, I'll be brief, honestly. All I'll do is just troubleshoot here and there, and you will see the reply. The discussion will be along that line. The first thing to say is that it's common knowledge that everybody knows that the so-called Niger Delta question and Niger Delta struggle revolves around injustice. And when you see me put my hand like this, it means that I question what they call Niger Delta struggle. It revolves around injustice, it revolves around poverty, it revolves around corruption. Virtually, greater majority or percentage of the Nigerian elites, beginning from the military to the civilians. I have, in different occasions, postulated that Nigerians do not abhor corruption, and I'll repeat it here, that what Nigerians want is that every Nigerian will have an opportunity of having a bite at the oil money. So they don't want anybody to stay more than 6 to 7 months. They just stay 6, 7 months and get out, so that others will come. They believe that if we do that, the 140 or is it 150, our population changes according to who is speaking. Either 140 or 150 million Nigerians would have had a bite on the national resource, and then one day all of us will be rich. Now, what drives Nigerians, and I'll keep it to Niger Delta, is poverty. 70% of Nigerian population is poor. Uloshenka and myself were together in the conference in Port Harcourt. I think Professor Jega was there when somebody said that, and Uloshenka did agree, that the reason for kidnapping is that 90% of Nigerians are poor. So they have 90% of Nigerians trying to kidnap the others to be able to have access to the resources. Then you have 10% of Nigerians having kidnapped our resources. And Uloshenka said, no, 10% is too wide a margin. Something like 5%, which means 95% of Nigerians are involved in kidnapping in various sources. And you think kidnapping is only kidnapping human beings. You can kidnap people's resources. You can kidnap state fund. You can kidnap even senators. There was I don't know who I told this story. I read in the newspaper where a Nigerian senator went to London, and an armed robber from Nigeria met him in London and said, give me your money, I'll kill you. And the man said, please, I'm just a Nigerian senator. He said, okay, in that case, give me our money. So when you hear Niger Delta question, Niger Delta is poverty. It pervades every part of Nigerian society. It leads to the Boko Haram that you have in the north. The same that there's this group you have in the west. What do you call them? OPC. And then all that. And then the Niger Delta, you have all different groups of people with different names. It depends on what you do. If you arrest one for murder, it's a Niger Delta Progressive Movement. I'm fighting for freedom for Niger Delta. If you arrest the other for raping a woman, it's a Niger Delta Independent Forum. That led me to rape the woman. But whether you like it or not, you cannot also divorce the crisis in Niger Delta from the crisis of injustice, the fact that the oil comes from a particular zone and not even a bridge can cross the riverine areas. So you have a people that lack education, lack power. In fact, it becomes even strange for you to bring power to them because you completely dehumanize them when you bring that power. And power comes to them only because you have oil. And I see it has its own international dimension, honestly. The Americans won't deny that. They're interested in Niger Delta today, not because Niger Delta is the only part of Nigeria that there is crisis. It's because that is where the energy resource comes from. I hope you remember that. And if you deny these countries the oil that comes from Niger Delta, there will be a problem in their countries. They have to stop that. So we must eradicate all this. So if you want to see what I'm saying, I'm saying that the political economy, you must analyze the political economy of the crisis to be able to decide what you're talking about Niger Delta. Finally, inside the Niger Delta itself, there are those who postulate the idea that they are freedom fighters and they will have to fight for freedom. They are also elites. They have been given all sorts of ministerial appointments, all sorts of contracts and all that. With one word, if you leave us, we'll be able to rein in the boys. They have had these appointments, they have had these contracts, they have not been able to rein in the boys. And that is because the major question is not the capacity to rein in the boys, it's the capacity to eradicate poverty. So if you want to be able to sort out the Niger Delta crisis, you have to address the issue of poverty. To address the issue of poverty, you have to address the issue of managing the resources of Nigeria, whether it is located in Niger Delta or located in the north or located in the west or any part of Nigeria. And to address that, you have to address corruption. And the greatest problem for addressing corruption is the fact that people do things in Nigeria with impunity and nobody gets punished. Thank you very much.
Next.
Could I have the PowerPoint, please? Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to clarify a couple of things. I was indeed a visiting scholar at SAIS in African Studies, and I've just finished a fellowship at the U.S. Institute of Peace where I've been looking at resource abundance, how it can be a blessing and not a curse. And one thing that we keep coming up with over and over again is the issue of governance, which we'll talk about a little bit further into my discussion. I'm currently back as the working with an NGO, Academic Associates Peaceworks, based in Warri, and trying to work on constructive engagement of youth in the upcoming elections. So I was very interested in the previous panel. Okay. I'm in control of this clicker. This is wonderful. For those of you who don't know Nigeria too much, this is a map showing the 36 states plus the Federal Capital Territory. The Niger Delta is the states along the bottom. They are going from Udoh over to Akwa Cross River, even though it's not a major oil producer. What the Niger Delta looks like in reality, as you can see on this map, an incredibly dense mass of small creeks and rivers, very difficult to move around in. I lived in one community for 5 months, and at the end of my time there, I don't think I could have found my way out by boat because it's one little twisting turn after another. Now, we're talking about the Niger Delta, and most people think about militants. And this is the image that comes to them when they hear the word Niger Delta militants. Sometimes it's not exactly as positive as that. Here are some militants who did not come off so well in the attacks of 2009. I'm going to look at a number of conflict drivers. The men's statement of March 1st, 2006 listed out a number of demands or requests from the Nigerian government, and I put them into 4 categories, and this is what I call conflict drivers. The lack of participation in the oil and gas industry that largely impacts the region. The lack of socioeconomic development, which Governor Amaechi has just mentioned. The lack of good governance and participation in the governance process. And lastly, over-militarization of the region. And you'll see quickly that this is what the area looks like. This is a classic flow station in the Niger Delta, where you have the gas burning off, leading to a very high level of pollution and also heat. This is the classic house along the creeks of the Niger Delta. So when we talk about socioeconomic underdevelopment, this is what we mean. This is how people live in an oil-producing region that produces by far the highest percentage of income for the Nigerian government. And corruption. This is a very big, important part of life in the Niger Delta. Huge amounts of money, corruption on many parts. Lastly, over-militarization of the region. It's not at all unusual to find lorries or boats full of armed soldiers patrolling the region. Now, I started working with the militants in the Niger Delta back in 2004, and a number of you will remember the face of Alhaji Asari Dokubo, who was one of the militant leaders brought to Abuja by President Obasanjo in October 2004. His other colleague in that fight was Ateke Tom. Interestingly, this is a picture of Ateke Tom with a different president on October 1st, 2009. So what happened to the peace process that started in 2004 had to be repeated again in 2009 and is still continuing, and indeed, I think, has broken down to a large degree. Now, some of the militants that I worked with were leaders of armed groups. The one on the left is a guy called Udoh, who was the head of the KKK. For people in the States, imagine having the Klansmen in Nigeria, but that was the case. Cassie, the man on the right, was a national leader of the Islando, another major cult or confraternity group in the Niger Delta. One interesting point, if you look at a history of these guys, is that you find not only a repetition of a peace process from 2004 to, again, 2009, you see some of the leaders, same leaders resurging, but also new generations of leaders rising up. And I think those are some of the things that we're seeing in the Niger Delta today and why we're having a resurgence of violence. Here's one of the last pictures that we have of the three wise men who were working with me as peace builders. They came to me and said that they would like to help other people get out of the cycle of violence. Not long after that, Udoh, the man on the right, was shot by the police and is paralyzed from the neck down. Cassie, the man in the middle, was also killed under very dubious circumstances. JP, the man on the left, continued to work with me until 2007 when I left Nigeria temporarily. And he was recently the spokesman. If you see reports of the amnesty camp from July 2010, he was Commander Gospel Tamano, who was supposedly transformed to nonviolence, even though he'd been working in peace and conflict management with me since 2005. Now here we have some new armed group leaders in the Delta. The man in blue is Boy Loaf, who you see has become quite a spokesperson. And he was brought to President Yar'Adua to disarm very early in August 2009. He was also a key figure in the peace process in Bayelsa State in 2007. This was part of the amnesty process that happened. This was in Bayelsa State when huge numbers of men handed in their weapons as part of the DDR process in 2009. Then meetings were held with President Yar'Adua, and these are some of the leaders. If you hear the name Tom Polo, you will see Tom Polo on the far left-hand side of the picture, and the man sitting next to him is the same Ateke Tom again. Now, for those of you who have been following what's been happening in the Delta recently, there's been a rise of a former follower of Tom Polo, a fellow called John Togo. And the attacks that happened just a couple of days ago in the Delta were actually in an attempt to find and capture John Togo. Unfortunately, something like 150 people were probably killed in the violence in the communities. So what we found before in 2004 with new generations coming up to contest the leadership of Asari and Ateke is happening now again under this amnesty. And you may ask yourself, why does this keep repeating itself? Here's another major leader, Soboma George. He was killed in July in Port Harcourt, and he had supposedly disarmed in August 2009, and yet he was killed in dubious circumstances in August 2010. Now, why does nothing happen to actually address some of these issues? I think a key part is that there is very definitely a conflict economy of the Niger Delta, where it is in the interest of one or more parties to not actually resolve the conflicts, but rather to keep them going for their own selfish benefits. I've studied this quite a bit, and I've written several papers, one on oil bunkering and one on understanding the armed groups. And my paper for USIP will also be dealing with the issue of oil abundance. And I think that there are a number of key issues to addressing the whole thing of the conflict economy of the Niger Delta. One is to stop the avenues for criminal activities, including bunkering and arms importations, not just to the militants, but of all the other parties involved, including the Nigerian military, retired and serving. Another one will require outside assistance. For example, we know that there are ways of fingerprinting oil, and it is possible to trace oil, what particular field it came from, and even mixed with other quantities of oil, it can be identified. Maritime security is something that has been offered by foreign partners but never quite accepted by the Nigerian government. Dry up the markets for stolen oil. There's a Dow Jones journalist in London who has tracked a number of vessels of stolen oil to markets in Europe and Eastern Europe in particular, and yet nothing is being done about drying up the market for this oil that is helping to fuel the conflict in the Niger Delta. I think there also needs to be help with money laundering and illegal arms importations. Now, I believe that the Nigerian government, in order to stop the situation there needs to be a halt to political participation, patronage of thugs and the use of violence. There needs to be election legitimacy. And I think we're all relieved to see that there's way forward on this in Nigeria for 2011. We need to address the issue of resource ownership. There needs to be a real DDR process. As you can see from the resurgence of violence in the Delta these days, only a fraction of the arms were handed in, and a fraction of the militants actually participated in the amnesty process. There needs to be real amnesty and protection for the militants. You've seen how many of these guys were killed after a would-be amnesty. So there needs to be some sort of a protection program for them, and real development efforts. But I think that this requires several things. One, an admission that everything is not right. We heard yesterday in the Rwanda panel that we need to admit that things are not as they should be. The same thing, paying some guys off for an amnesty process is not addressing the core issues of the Niger Delta, which I identified earlier. Until these issues are addressed, there never will be peace in the Niger Delta. And that requires real political will on the part of the Nigerian government and its foreign partners. It also requires a political space for citizens to participate in their own governance process. We've heard a lot about governance and a lot about we the people and people taking responsibility for their own governance. So there has to be the space for this and also the willingness of citizens to participate. And that's one of the reasons why I'm working now on trying to get youth constructively engaged in the upcoming elections, to empower them to feel that they can own their political process and participate in choosing their elected leaders. This is the ABC triangle of conflict. I'm sorry, I'm not very good at graphics. It doesn't look like a triangle.
Please round up, Judith, please.
Yes, I will.
Yeah, please.
But the whole idea of attitudes, behavior, and context. You can change one thing, but unless you change the others, it will keep leading on to yet another resurgence of armed violence in the Delta. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. In the past presentation, we have heard a lot of words, corruption, injustice. I want to add bad governance to it. And I also want to add lack of development. The issue of the Niger Delta is clearly an issue of injustice. It is clearly an issue of oppression. And where there is oppression, there are oppressors, and then there are the people who are oppressed. And as long as there is an oppressor and an oppressed, there will be resistance. This has gone on for 50 years. Let us not forget that what is happening in the Niger Delta today is a resistance that has emerged after 50 years of neglect and abuse of a region and of a people. The issue of environmental devastation is a very key part of this crisis in the Niger Delta. I grew up in the Niger Delta. I was 4 years old when my father brought me from England, and I was taken to my community, which is in the Niger Delta. I was raised in the Niger Delta creeks. I know the creeks like the back of my hand. Unlike Judith, I can go into the creeks and find my way out because I grew up there. Now, having this sort of background, it is impossible, it is difficult, if not near impossible for me not to be doing what I am doing today in the Niger Delta, which is speaking up on behalf of the Niger Delta people, which is a selfish thing, really, because I'm actually speaking for myself. Because when there is no light, when there are no roads, when the abuse that we know worldwide is happening in my community, I have no choice but to speak up. We're talking about the military that is occupying the Niger Delta. We're talking about a lack of education. We hear that our people are not educated. How can they be educated? There are no schools for them to be educated in. How can they be healed if they are ill? There are no hospitals for them when they are ill. I come from a waterine community. In the community where I come from, some of the people that come from my local government are 2.5 hours away by boat. When a woman is ill or she's giving birth and she has complications like placenta previa, and she is unable to be taken out quickly, and it takes 2.5 hours to get her out of that community to the nearest landed community, which happens to be my community, Abonima. And then she's driven by road for another 1.5 hours to get to the nearest hospital. Any woman here who's had complications of birth with placenta previa will know that that woman will die because she'll bleed to death. So these are the things that have engaged our people to realize that something is critically very wrong with a situation like what it is in the Niger Delta. Now, the Niger Delta, we all know, is an area that is swampy, is an area that is difficult to develop, where it will take 10 of something to develop a landed area. It will take maybe 10 times that to do the same development in the area that the riverine people come from. Ken Saro-Wiwa fought for the rights of his people and the rights to stop the devastation of his environment. Ken Saro-Wiwa was murdered for that. Ken Saro-Wiwa never slung an AK-47 on his back. He had a pen in his hand, and yet he was murdered. So it is wrong. It is wrong to say that the issues of environment in the Niger Delta is because of militancy. It is not. Militancy is a result of the devastation and the neglect of the people of the Niger Delta. Militancy, people say criminality has taken over the agitation. It's not true. Criminality will always exist in America, in Nigeria, anywhere in the world. There are criminals. There are criminals in the Niger Delta that have taken advantage of the just fight of my people. But that cannot take away from the fact that we have a just fight on our hands. There are criminals there, yes. There are also criminals in government. The lack of quality governance is criminality. When you cannot account, when the government, the federal government, state government, senators, how is it that senators in Nigeria can earn the amount of money that they are earning? Where is that justification? And where is the money coming from? The money is coming from these neglected areas. The money is coming from these abused people. And yet you say that you are representing these people and the people are starving. There is no education facility for them. There is no healthcare facility for them. These are the things that we're talking about. When we say that in the Niger Delta there is oil theft, what precisely is oil theft? oil theft has been going on in Nigeria for as long as the oil companies have existed in Nigeria. Oil theft was happened upon by people like Asari and Ateke when they relocated into the creeks. And may I say here categorically that Ateke Tom and Asari Dokbo did not start off as fighting for the Niger Delta. No, they did not. What happened was, we all know the story, but they ended up in the creeks because one was looking for the other to kill. And that was how they ended up in the creeks. And from there, developed the fact and the opportunity to say, you know what, since these guns are here, because what is happening is politicians created this monster that is called armed youths in the Niger Delta. There has never been election. I have been away from Nigeria since 1970 after the Civil War. And I came back finally in 1998. And from 1999 till today, there has never been an election in the Niger Delta. Let me not even talk about Nigeria. In the Niger Delta, my sister Ijaw said it to Professor Jega, that let us not find ourselves in a situation where tomorrow my people will not be able to vote because we didn't realize that we're going to use boats. Now, some of these communities are 3 hours away by boat. These people have to be registered and they have to vote. So how do we get them registered? And on the day of voting, how do we get their vote to count? These are the issues that is confronting Nigeria. And really, if we're going to have changes and make these very critical changes that will move Nigeria forward, we all have to sit down and tell ourselves some basic home truths. And some of these truths are the issues of resource ownership. I come from a community that produces oil and gas. It's in my local government. And until it is taken away from me officially, and right now that is what is happening, those oils have been ceded to Bayelsa State. Now, if these are the issues that we're talking about, for government not to take the responsibility in the Niger Delta and in Nigeria as a whole to make these changes that are very critical to move Nigeria forward, we will continue to have what is going on in the Niger Delta. No matter the campaign we're going to put out, and we are putting them out, that there has to be one man, one vote, one Nigerian, one vote, and that our votes must count. But by what we have today, it is looking like it is an impossibility because we're now looking at a situation where we will have what is likely to be not a very good election, but definitely better than what we have had before. In Nigeria today, we can see very clearly, like in the Niger Delta, the only governor that we can actually say that have the people's mandate is the governor of Edo State, because his election, we all know what happened, and people came out and they voted for him. Now, these are the things that we're talking about. So if we want to tell ourselves the truth in Nigeria and about the rights of the people and how we're going to make these changes to come about in the lives of the people, if we're not going to have a situation, see, people don't want to face the facts. The fact is, the fact is, what we are confronting in Nigeria today is if we don't all sit down and tell ourselves the truth, no matter how hard we try, we're going to have to face the reality one day that Nigeria is too big a country and has too many different people in it for it to continue as Nigeria. Thank you.
Ambassador Campbell. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Let me start by putting two issues on the table for you. The first is, what do we call these recurrent episodes of violence in the Delta that have gone on, as previous panelists have observed, for at least 50 years? That's the first. And what I'm going to do in my comments is I'm going to use the term that another African ambassador used when he came back from a visit to the Delta in 2006. The word he used was insurrection. He said to me, "I have participated in an insurrection in my own country. I know one when I see one." That's the first point. The second point that I want to put on the table is that an insurrection that goes on for more than 50 years is more than poverty, lack of economic development, criminality, or any of the other relatively facile explanations that we all use from time to time. My argument this afternoon is that fundamentally, too many people in the Niger Delta acquiesce to or actively support an insurrection because they are alienated from their government at all levels. This alienation should be no surprise. They have been excluded from virtually all political processes, except occasionally at the micro level. Since the restoration of civilian rule, elections have not been credible anywhere in the Niger Delta. I recall immediately after the 2007 elections, a marvelous old woman from the Delta looking me straight in the face and saying, "These were the best elections we have ever had." I said, "Oh." She said, "Yes, no ballots arrived, nobody voted, and nobody died." Maybe as we think about the recurring insurgency or insurrection in the Delta, we should think back to colonialism. Is the Delta, in effect, a colony of those who control the Nigerian state, based in Abuja, with the major oil companies as junior partners? I say junior partners because oil and gas production in Nigeria is accomplished through joint ventures and joint partnerships with the national oil company, which almost always has the majority share. And at least 90% of the profits from oil and gas go to the state. The distribution of profits from oil and gas is determined by a national formula administered by Abuja, not in the Delta. While there is some accountability as to how the revenue is used at the federal level, there is little or none at the state or local government levels. So, the Delta people have little or no role in deciding who is going to govern them or how. And too many elected officials show little accountability toward the people whom they govern. Now, how to end the disaffection of the Delta people, which, in my view, is necessary to end the insurgency for good? A first step, as many panelists have said during the course of the day, would be credible elections in at least some parts of the Delta in 2011. Credible elections could also advance the principle that elected officials, from the president on down, are accountable to the people whom they govern. A second step would be to establish a credible political process to address the myriad grievances of the Delta, both at the national and at local levels. Disarmament and payoffs to local warlords, absent a political process, simply will not work. We also must be patient. restoring, or creating for the first time, faith in government in the Delta is bound to be a long process. But it is not unrealistic to hope that the elections, credible elections, in some part of the Delta, some parts of the Delta, in what is now only a few months, could indeed start the process. Thank you.
I do not come from the Riverine area. I'm still, anytime I go home, there's no road to get to my home in the Delta. I'll offer a few comments on the amnesty program in the Niger Delta. The technical committee on the Niger Delta that recommended amnesty to the militants made two important recommendations: to provide opportunity for young people to acquire important life skills, gain well-paying jobs, or become self-employed, and participate meaningfully in deciding critical community issues, including the management and utilization of the region's resources. Number two, to address structural and cultural discriminations against women and create new frameworks that promote women's equal rights and status with men in various facets of public life. Since that report was published in 2008, efforts to implement the amnesty program in the Niger Delta appears to be marred by a lack of strategy. There is a narrow focus on training and compensating selected disarmed militants, a misguided strategy that cannot be sustained. That appears to reflect the government's chief interest in ensuring an uninterrupted flow of oil, rather than a concern for human capacity development and creation of economic opportunity for all youth in the Niger Delta. Focusing only on militants sends the wrong message that youth have to involve in militancy in order to receive help from the state. The amnesty program cannot be successfully implemented without a buy-in from the region's youth and their mothers and sisters. Given the obvious challenges with corruption and incompetency, the Nigerian government is not currently equipped to manage the implementation of the amnesty program alone. What can be done? Government can use appropriate ministries to create competitive grant programs with clearly defined goals, objectives, and eligibility criteria that reflect the priorities of the amnesty program. This program can comprise of different funding tracks under management of teams of local-based Nigerian experts and those in the diaspora. Niger Deltans and Nigerian citizens with relevant expertise, including individuals, universities, non-profit organizations, community and faith-based organizations, should be able to apply for funding in an open, rigorous, and transparent application process. Grant recipients can create programs that benefit a large population of youth and women, not just ex-militants, from urban and rural communities in every state of the region. Programs that cover the entire gamut of youth and community development needs in the region, including a concentration in science and technology. Using this approach ensures that the amnesty program and the region's development are based on comprehensive, innovative, cutting-edge, and evidence-based conceptual frameworks with appropriate monitoring and evaluation and community-driven sustainability plans. This approach promotes transparency, partnership, and grassroots participation in the conception, design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of specific projects within the amnesty program. It recognizes the region's youth, including ex-militants and women, as stakeholders and co-creators of wealth and peace with governments and oil companies. The current approach of doling out monthly payouts to selected ex-militants fosters a chronic and dangerous dependence on government and oil companies and makes the beneficiaries potentially vulnerable to exploitation and abuse by political and oil industry operatives. Youth and women's programming in the Niger Delta needs to target a generic set of abilities that goes beyond academic or cognitive competencies to include vocational, physical, emotional, civic, social, cultural, and moral competence. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My remarks will no doubt underscore and refer to some very clear points that were ably made by other panelists, and I'll offer some comparative reflections as well in terms of how we move forward in the Niger Delta. I'd like to start by just observing what, for me at any rate, was a surprise, and that was the surprise of October 2009. The October 2009 amnesty program, inaugurated by President Yaradua, drew a much greater response than many of us expected. And to date, that program has enrolled in the first round some 20,000 militants. We can use quotation marks around that title, but we can call them militants. Another 6,000 are being enrolled now, and they have retrieved about 5,000 weapons. And quite apart from whether we think they were real militants or simply coming in for the stipends, whether the weapons were the good weapons or the old and obsolete weapons, there has been a surprising and extended reduction of violence, allowing for increased oil production over the last year or so. And there's a question here about why this even happened, because those of us who were observing and have been following and engaged in the downward spiral of insurrection and bad governance in the Delta did not see the possibility a year back or a year and a half ago, of a serious initiative by the government, particularly one so partial and ad hoc as this amnesty program has been, that could seriously not resolve, but seriously address the problem of violence. Maybe there was a degree of fatigue on the part of the militants who are operating in difficult territory and making only intermittent gains in difficult and challenging circumstances. Maybe, and we see this quite commonly in resource-based conflicts, the warlords and the commanders were making a great deal of money and gains from the trafficking in oil, but the average militants were not, and they were taking great risks. They were involved in rivalries with other groups, and they were seeing their friends and comrades killed, and to no good purpose, and they became fatigued or disillusioned. Maybe the challenge by the military in May of 2009 essentially changed the calculus by introducing a new level of coercion and force that MEND and the militants had not previously encountered, and it raised the costs of conflict. I'm speculating, I don't know, but clearly something happened. Violence declined. Oil production for the last year or so has been at about 2.1 million barrels a day at a good price, and the revenues are coming in. Where they're going is a separate question that we can talk about. That's a sorry story, but as it always is. But that is clearly the revenues are coming in. It is just as clear that this is a tremendously fragile peace, that it's eroding and fraying as we speak, and that it could easily come unraveled as we approach an uncertain election season. Only a portion of the militants and the weapons have come in. It's quite typical in demobilization programs to get fewer weapons than fighters to come in from the conflict. But clearly 5,000 weapons is only a fraction of what is still available for use in mobilization, and 25,000 militants are probably no more than a third of the number of potential recruits who could be, even a year and a half ago, who could have been brought in by the commanders. Most important, not only is there just a portion of weapons and fighters in this program, but the program does not address the underlying grievances and agendas that fueled the insurrection over the years. It does not even begin to do that. And previous speakers have talked about payments and stipends and retraining programs as being rather token and insufficient, and I would certainly agree with that. For a sustainable resolution of the Niger Delta insurgency, there really have to be essentially three dimensions and three pieces. One is a peace process focused on demobilization and reintegration and disarmament and negotiations with the fighters that can be brought into negotiations. There's a problem of negotiating with MEND, which, like Linux, has been called an open source insurgency without a centralized leadership or a clear political wing to talk to. But nonetheless, there has to be a peace process. There has to be a parallel, however, political process which would meet the demands for representation and empowerment, political empowerment on the part of the people of the Delta, and elections would be the first step in a political process and an important step. And there must be a development process which really addresses the question of poverty and economic opportunity and environmental degradation that we've heard talked about so clearly and so eloquently by previous speakers. Right now, what we see is a partial effort on peace, mainly through the use of short-term stipends and really improvised training programs as a basis for taking a portion of the militants out of action and sort of keeping them busy. But there is no political or development peace in the process that has been sustained, deepened, or taken forward. And there's been no serious effort to address the conflict economy and the economic agendas that Judy Asuni mentioned. Let me take 1 minute to just refer to an example of a resource-based insurgency in a neglected region that was successfully resolved, and that was the case of Aceh. I realize I talked about Indonesia earlier. I have a bit of Indonesia on the brain, but this is really kind of coincidental. For 35 years, the gas-rich region of northern Sumatra, known as Aceh, was the site of an insurgency for secession, for the partition of the country, and militants that were trying to break away from Indonesia. After the tsunami a few years ago, there was an opportunity, because of the provision of relief and some development aid, to re-engage the insurgency with negotiations. There was a central organization, there was an identifiable leadership who conveniently was in Sweden, where they could be located for negotiations. And this opened the door to a process sponsored by the United Nations and the regional organization ASEAN the Southeast Asian Nations Association. And they sponsored a process which addressed all the key issues in these negotiations: revenue allocation and local resource control, elections and governance. In a highly centralized system, they got a measure of autonomy, and the DDR process. So there were comprehensive negotiations, which were not only brokered, but also partially guaranteed by regional and external powers. And in very short order, in a very compressed period of time, this insurgency was ended after 35 years, and a new political dispensation and a new resource dispensation was agreed, and the insurgency was resolved. And the basis of what I think is a sustainable peace has been established. So my concluding comment is simply this. We can already see from the fragmentation of MEND and the recent attacks, notably the car bombings on October 1, that the fragile peace is eroding. We are moving into a very uncertain election season when politicians are much more inclined to sponsor and encourage militias. So this is a dangerous moment. And it's time now for any serious government that wants to at least sustain the peace for now and create the foundation for long-term resolution in the Niger Delta to focus on politics and development. As previous speakers have said, elections will be key, but also trying, even in the limited time available to this administration, and certainly for the next administration, getting quick development results on the ground. If the government takes a comprehensive approach and tries to really attack the various dimensions of this insurgency, I think there is a basis for moving forward. Thank you.
Very brief final comments from the ambassador.
Yes, I'll actually be very brief. And it was a little bit strategy on my part to speak last so that I would just say I agree with what everybody has said. And I really mean it because there's no way you can disagree with what has been said. We know how we got to where we are. I mean, quite a number of causes: neglect, bad governance, corruption, lack of political will, administrative bottlenecks, and all this has brought us to where we were. I don't think there is anybody who is in his right minds who will criticize the spirit and the idea behind the militancy. Militancy, more or less, is a forceful expression of accumulated grievances of the people of the Niger Delta area, and which could be understood within the context of our history, of our politics, of the type of things that happen to Nigeria. And I mean, you cannot but see that there's a reason in what these people are doing. There's a cause for it. The challenge to successive governments is how to handle it. And all in the past, particularly under the military regime, people thought that you could just take some guns there and they take gate here or beat here, whatever they say, and beat the people to submission. It took some time before the government realized that force alone cannot do this. You see, the people's will are irrepressible. When the people have a cause that is just and right, you cannot just take some guns there and kill them and think they will keep quiet. That is what has come. People like Jasper Boro and Sarawiwa did not die in vain, and their spirits are there, still pushing this because the cause for which they fought was just and right. But the point is, now that's what one of these things we call the dividends of democracy. The Yar'Adua and Jonathan regime saw rightly that successive application of force will lead to no end, and that was why this amnesty program was conceived. Fine, there's still some. The implementation, the manner and style and speed of implementation still leaves much to be desired. But you can all see the desired results in terms of increase in oil production, at least some decline in the intensity of military activities. And all that it needs is continuous application of political will to ensure that this fragile peace is strengthened. Because you cannot, the will of the people cannot be subdued. The other point I just want to bring to the information of members of this audience is that apart from the amnesty program and debates and discussions are still going at home in order to make it much more effective and successful, although one cannot deny the fact that preoccupation with politics is beginning to push everything to the back burner. People, politicians are more interested in how they're going to get there. There is the fact that there's been an external dimension to it. Many countries are interested in Nigeria, mainly because of the oil. But of course, some have been very, very constructive in their approach to us, in their attitude to us on the issue of the Niger Delta. I think I didn't bring to your knowledge the existence of what we call the binational commission. We signed a binational commission agreement with the United States of America. This was in April this year. And the binational commission agreement is being described as the highest level of strategic cooperation that can exist between two countries. There are 4 components of the binational commission. The first one is on transparency, governance, and integrity. And that has to do with the issue of establishing democracy and make it work. And they are cooperating with Professor Jega and his team right now and increase assistance to the Electoral Commission. The second one is on energy and investment. Has to do with oil and gas and oil and gas, NEPA, and the rest of it. The third one is on Niger Delta and regional security. The first meeting on the issue of Niger Delta and regional security was held some 2 months ago. Governor Amaechi was there. That was my first time of really getting close to him, knowing what he has been doing. And I don't know why he adopted such a low-profile approach today. And by the time you listen to him, what he was doing in the River State, you'll be amazed that it's not only Raji Fashola that is a good governor in Nigeria. There's somebody like Rotimi Amaechi, but who's, maybe because he's in River State there, people don't know much about him. And people, you don't know much about him as we know Fashola here. But the point I want to stress is that there's an international dimension to this issue of Niger Delta, and in the case, especially with the American government, and the last meeting was attended by people who are really experienced in the issue of post-conflict settlement, retraining and people, rehabilitation, reconstruction, and people who have skill knowledge in dealing with issues of the Niger Delta. They have started working, but some of these things, they take some time before the effects are seen. But I want to assure you that is really going on, and that's something we should focus on. There is a few more minutes. Haba. Yes, quickly.
1 more minute.
Okay. You are not being democratic, my friend.
No.
Okay. The negative aspect of international dimension to this issue is that the Nigerian government have been trying to internationalize the criminalization of people, the oil bunkering, putting emphasis on trying to define something like blood oil. Those are people who have been trying to talk of blood diamonds. We're still seeking some support of international community to get so that when people vandalize oil lines and the rest of it and do bunkering, and the proceeds will be very difficult for them to sell. But I don't know. You all know how the way in which the Nigerian government have been trying to deal with the issue of Niger Delta. I want to assure you that the truth and the fact is that if you don't get it right in the Niger Delta, the security of the country will be threatened. Because the live wire of the country, the oil money there, is the one that is sustaining all of us. And it's a issue of serious political, economic, and social dimension that we have to get it right before we can be sure of the stability of the country. And I'm sure that, the government realizes it. And this has been shown in several areas. Even on the issue of political leadership, you just can't ignore the interests of the people of Niger Delta. Otherwise, you just be working on one foot. So the thing is that the government realizes how important Niger Delta is, and I want to assure you that this present government takes it with all kinds of seriousness. Of course, they simply have no choice. So let us, since the chairman has stopped me, let us resolve. I want to inform you that the government takes the matter with all seriousness. And like all other problems confronting us, we are trying to solve it. And some first major steps have been taken in getting to Nigeria of our dream. This one of these to ensure that there is peace, security in the Niger Delta. And by the grace of God, we shall get there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I? Okay. Is this thing working here? Okay, it works. Okay. I know there's going to be some questions, but very, very quickly, I need to pose some questions to each one of these. Governor Amaechi, when you sit down and you hear statements like there has been no elections, credible elections in the Niger Delta, and that the only governor who has a mandate in the Niger Delta is somebody, and you are governor of Rivers State, who was not on the ballot for many reasons, more than we can say here. I want you to respond to that very quickly. Now, that's for you.
I'd like to
Number two, to Ms. Asuni. I'm sure many people are wondering, what were you doing in the Niger Delta at that particular point? I'm sure, I'm trying to play a situation where Barbara Walters, you know she's going to ask some questions of some people. So that's what I want to find out from you, what you were doing in the Niger Delta, knowing all of these people. Ambassador Campbell, you said something about insurrection in the colony of the Niger Delta. That, I think, is a little bit provocative. I just wanted you to see how we can decolonize the Niger Delta. Dr. Udoh, you said that, and the issue of competitive grants is what you talked about. The thing that still amazes me is that no one of you spoke either about OMPADEC or NDDC, and yet we spend a lot of money through these organizations over the years. Is this what you would say on top of the NDDC or in replacement of NDDC? Dr. Peter Lewis, you mentioned something about elections, for example, and I like the issue of peace process, political process, and development process. What else is new? I think you said that the peace process is going on, but there's no political process or development process to talk about. Finally, Ambassador Adefuye, the issue of the Binational Commission. I know that you're ambassador to the United States, but there are 10, 12, 14 other Western nations who are trying to impact on Nigeria. We will have a binational commission with each one of them, or will it be a bi-international commission we should have? I won't forget Ms. Briggs. You are a daughter of the place. What single thing can be done to ensure that elections, these coming elections, will be credible? Thank you.
Do I start or take last?
Yes, please, you start.
Now, I'd like to warn the audience. When I became the governor of Rivers State, I met a culture on ground, the culture of sharing the Rivers State money. How many people are from Rivers State here? True or false? Well, you live in America. You live in America, that's why. Now, not from the way you're speaking. I met a culture of sharing money when I became the governor of Rivers State. I chose to either continue with that or not to continue with that. I looked at it, and my mind told me, continue with development. Don't be a popular governor. Be a governor that will take the right decision for the interests of the people. How many of you watched Nigeria at 50 by BBC? Did you see Rivers State? Then you didn't watch. If you watch, BBC came to Niger Delta and they came with the same accusation. We hear you who are not developing Niger Delta. You're corrupt. You're all stealing the money. I said, I have no answer to you. I will take you to the whole of Rivers State for 2 days. Give me 2 days, and I'll take you around. That will be the answer to that question. And they went around with me, including her village, including the so-called Abonema she's talking about. And there was a health center there that you could take people down to treat. But when you refuse to give people money, they become NGOs in the Niger Delta. When they refuse to pay people's school fees, their children's school fees, they become NGOs in the Niger Delta. You know, I ask this question. Are we law-abiding? Do we want an election that will be do we believe in rule of law? If the answer is yes, the apex of rule of law in Nigeria is the Supreme Court, is it not? So if the Supreme Court says Amaechi was elected, I was duly elected. God bless all of you.
That is it.
I can see, as a professional peace builder, I can see that Professor Oluku is not a professional peace builder as he's making all these difficult questions. My immediate response would be that I was a dangerous espionage agent in the Niger Delta, as we can ask our presidential spokesperson, Adeni. I had started out working on inter-ethnic and interreligious conflicts, and I worked in Plateau, Kano, gotten to work in some other inter-ethnic things like Ife, Modakeke, etc. And that's how I got to know Atake Tom through work on Okrika and Aleme conflicts, and how I got to know Asari Dokubo through interreligious peace-building type things. So when I got involved eventually in the Delta and was involved with community conflicts, then led into political conflicts, and that's how I got to know all of these militants. What I hoped to show you through the photographs was that these guys have human faces, that they look like anybody else's sons once you take off the mask, and that a lot of them have very valid reasons for what they do. It's not irrational. I remember being with one of my favorite militant spokesmen who's just finished 2 master's degrees and was on Facebook with me the other day to say he wants to do his PhD now in international relations. You know, this is a guy who understands political science, and he was saying that foreign countries cannot intervene in the sovereignty of nations, they cannot intervene in some of the hostage-type issues. These are rational guys, and I think their energy can be directed in a more positive way, and that's one of the things that I try to do.
Next.
Who's next?
Oh, I guess I'm Mr. Campbell. Sure.
No, but I thought you threw a question at me.
No, I threw a question to each person, but Mr. Campbell, you were last, Ms. Briggs, so you answer last, please, if you don't mind.
What I mean when I talk about the Delta as having essentially a colonial situation is I mean that its relationship to the rest of Nigeria is similar to that of a colony to a metropole, an area which is essentially a wealth producer, but not for the benefit of the people who live there, but rather for the metropole or the imperial power. What I am suggesting is that the imperialists in this particular case are not some foreign country, but rather other parts of Nigeria.
Okay, Dr. Udoh.
If you look at the NDDC, the history of the NDDC, that agency has been plagued by so many leadership issues. There are problems with methods for awarding contracts, and then there are management problems. And then recently, 3 members of NDDC were suspended for financial impropriety. This is like a week or 2 weeks ago. So I believe that the NDDC is not serving any significant useful purpose in the Niger Delta. So the NDDC can be folded into the Ministry of the Niger Delta, and then the grant process that I am proposing could be managed from that central ministry. Whatever the ministry would decide to do with NDDC, that is up to them. I can't tell them what to do, but we cannot have 2 parallel instruments that are meant to serve the same purpose. So it can be folded into the Ministry of the Niger Delta, and then that ministry will then develop different grant portfolios that serve the different needs in the Niger Delta.
Thank you. Peter?
Well, the question, what else is new? It's a question that we often ask at these meetings. The problems of the Niger Delta in terms of the basic grievances and the basic way forward have not been elusive for decades. They've been well known to everyone. Indeed, Isaac Boro had answers to it, Ken Saro-Wiwa had answers to it, the Niger Delta Congress that had 1 representative in the First Republic Parliament was trying to get representation. So the idea of political representation, the idea of development, the idea of equity in terms of resource control has been around for as long as Nigeria has been around, and in fact preceded that in the discussions for independence. So what is new? What is new is the current situation and the opportunity to consolidate a peace. There is a very tenuous opening created by circumstantial developments in the wake of the amnesty, and there is now an opportunity to try to consolidate it. The current president has publicly said that he's committed to that goal, but I think it's incumbent upon anybody who's interested in the Delta to point out ways in which that commitment or the strategy to realize it is lacking. And I think on the political side and on the development side, the inertia is going to be a real deficit and a real problem and a liability in terms of bringing or carrying forward the amnesty.
Ms. Briggs, and then we'll come to the ambassador last again.
I'm happy that I am not a politician. I do not come from a village, I come from a town. And my town does not need a health center, we need a hospital. There is already an existing hospital in my town that was built, and it is still in my town, it is not functioning. Now, having said that, you asked me about, the question you pointed at me was, the question of what is it that has to be done for us to have credible elections. Like I have said, I come from a riverine area. It takes at least an hour and a half to go to my town. Outside of my town, we have other communities, and these members of these other communities have to vote in these elections. They have to register in these elections. We need a situation where everybody that is attached to a polling booth will have to be registered, whether they're 20 people or 30 people, and then they also have to have the opportunity to vote. And I think that this is what Professor Jega is going to find very difficult for him to achieve because of the terrain in which I come from.
Thank you. Ambassador?
Very quickly, the government doesn't need to follow NDDC. Just as every other ministry, you have corporations or extra-ministerial agencies attached to it. It might need to be reformed, but it's still doing some useful purpose. BNC, there are many, yes, there are so many countries that are express interest in working with us on the Niger Delta. We don't need to sign bi-national commission agreement with them. You can sign bilateral treaties with them, and those are two different things, Mr. Moderator. Thank you.